Welcome back to the Global Narratives podcast. Sometimes we get source material that's just out there.
Right.
And this one definitely qualifies. You've sent us a collection of articles and excerpts about the possibility of Canada becoming,
Oh, wow.
wait for it, the 51st U.S. state.
It's a fascinating concept to consider, especially considering the source of this idea.
Right.
Former U.S. President Donald Trump.
I know.
To even think that a world leader
Yeah.
would even suggest absorbing an entire country.
I know.
Especially one as prominent as Canada.
It does seem a bit wild, right?
Yeah.
But that's what we're here for.
Absolutely.
We're diving deep into this annexation idea, exploring both sides, the potential impacts, and maybe even uncovering some historical parallels.
Yeah, along the way.
Exactly.
And to be clear, we're not here to endorse any particular viewpoint.
Right.
We're simply trying to understand the different perspectives and the historical context
Right.
surrounding this unusual concept.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So let's jump right in. Okay, we've got some quotes from Trump straight from the sources, and his reasoning is pretty straightforward.
Okay.
He talks about eliminating tariffs, Canadians getting lower taxes,
Right.
and even mentions perfect military protection.
Wow.
It almost sounds like a sales pitch, right?
It does have that feel to it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. What's intriguing, though, is that this kind of rhetoric has virtually no precedent in modern U.S. foreign policy.
Really?
It really goes against the grain of the post-World War II order, which is built around respecting national sovereignty.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And let's not forget the Canadian response.
Oh, yeah.
We've got Prime Minister Trudeau basically saying, not a snowball's chance in hell.
I love that quote.
It seems like the Canadian public is overwhelmingly against the idea.
Yeah.
And their leaders have been extremely clear about their stance.
Trudeau's response is not surprising at all.
Right.
Canada has a deep-rooted national identity.
Yeah.
And if we look back to the 19th century, fears of U.S. expansionism actually played a big part in Canada's formation.
It's like this whole conversation is stirring up some old ghosts, eh?
Right.
But here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Even though annexation is highly improbable,
Yeah.
Trump's words have had some unintended consequences.
Like what?
We've got sources talking about a surge in Canadian patriotism.
Oh, wow.
And even like Canada's not-for-sale merchandise flying off the shelves.
Wow, that's amazing.
It's kind of funny.
It is a fascinating paradox, though.
Right.
This rhetoric may be intended to disrupt or gain leverage, might have actually strengthened Canadian national identity.
Okay, so let's get down to brass tacks.
Okay.
If annexation is practically off the table,
Yeah.
what could be the motivation behind these statements?
Well, there are a few possibilities.
Okay.
One is that it's a way to unsettle the diplomatic status quo,
Okay.
to introduce uncertainty and maybe gain leverage in other areas like trade deals.
Ah, so it's a power play trying to shake things up a bit.
Exactly.
Kind of like a high-stakes poker game?
Exactly.
Okay.
Another possibility is that it appeals to a specific segment of U.S. voters,
Uh-huh.
those who view the expansion of American power favorably.
Right.
It might not be about Canada itself,
Right.
but about the image it projects back home.
Okay, interesting. So even though annexation is highly unlikely, let's play devil's advocate for a moment.
Okay.
Let's say, hypothetically, Canada did become the 51st state. What would that actually look like?
Well, for starters, get ready for a seismic shift in U.S. elections.
Oh, really?
Did you know that Canada's population would make it the largest state, surpassing California?
Whoa, really?
It is, and that translates to a lot of political power.
Right.
We're talking 2 senators, an estimated 55 House seats, and a whopping 57 Electoral College votes,
Wow.
exceeding California's 54.
That's a lot.
Imagine the impact on swing states and future presidential elections.
Talk about a political earthquake.
Right.
Okay, so besides the political shakeup,
Yeah.
what about the economic side of things?
Okay.
Our sources mentioned potential benefits like increased trade and a larger, more competitive market. Sounds good on paper, right?
Sure, but we need to look deeper.
Okay.
Would these benefits outweigh the costs?
Right.
Would smaller Canadian businesses be able to compete with larger U.S. corporations?
Good point.
And what about the Canadian dollar?
Yeah, good point. Speaking of specifics, our sources also mentioned the potential impact on healthcare costs.
Oh, yeah.
A big deal for Canadians used to their universal system.
Right.
And then there's the whole metric versus imperial units situation.
Oh, yeah.
Would Canadians be trading kilometers for miles?
Oh, man.
I know.
It's not just numbers and measurements, though.
Right.
We need to consider the social and cultural impacts of merging 2 distinct societies.
Right.
Canada has its own history,
Yeah.
approach to healthcare and social welfare,
Right.
and a strong national identity.
Right.
How would that blend with the U.S.?
That's a big question. Our sources highlight the differences in healthcare costs and accessibility. Canadians are proud of their system,
Yes.
often lauded for being universal and affordable.
Right.
While the U.S. system, well, let's just say it's known for being a bit more complicated and
A
expensive.
little bit, yeah.
Right.
And there's the question of bilingualism.
Oh, right.
Canada has two official languages, English and French.
Yeah.
How would that fit into the U.S. system?
Merging two distinct cultures, even ones as closely intertwined as Canada and the U.S., would definitely come with a whole host of challenges.
For sure.
It makes you wonder if all this talk of annexation could actually backfire
Right.
and strengthen Canadian national identity even more.
It's a possibility. Sometimes the suggestion of a threat can actually solidify a sense of unity and shared identity.
Right.
People start to reassess what's important and what they're willing to defend.
It's like a rallying cry, bringing people together against a common enemy,
Yeah.
even a hypothetical one.
Exactly.
So to understand this whole annexation idea better,
Yeah.
let's look back in time.
Okay.
Has the U.S. ever seriously considered annexing Canada before?
Well, if we dig into U.S. history, the idea has popped up here and there.
Okay.
But it's never been a central policy objective.
Right.
There have been moments like the War of 1812,
Uh-huh.
where the U.S. invaded Canada.
Right.
But the primary goal wasn't annexation.
Right.
It was more about using Canada as leverage in a broader conflict with Britain.
So it's not like the U.S. has this long-standing ambition to conquer Canada.
No, not exactly. There have been historical annexationist movements,
Right.
often fueled by economic grievances or dissatisfaction with British rule,
Okay.
but they were largely limited to specific regions or groups
Uh-huh.
and never gained widespread support.
Okay. And even when the U.S. considered annexing parts of what's now Canada, it was mainly focused on the sparsely populated western regions,
Right.
not the more populous east.
That's right. The focus was more on securing land and resources
Yeah.
than absorbing large populations.
Okay, so it seems like Canada becoming the 51st state is highly unlikely,
Yeah.
both practically and historically, but this whole conversation has definitely shed light on the intricate relationship between the U.S. and Canada, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's made us think about national identity,
Right,
the motivations behind unconventional political rhetoric,
right.
and the potential consequences of disrupting global norms.
Speaking of disrupting norms, there's another layer to this annexation idea
Okay.
that we haven't touched on yet.
What's that?
Albertan annexationism.
Oh, yeah.
This one's closer to home.
Yeah.
And it's a whole other can of worms.
Ah, yes, the notion of Alberta,
Right,
a Canadian province potentially joining the U.S.
right.
This adds another layer of complexity to our discussion.
So let's break this down a bit. What exactly is Albertan separatism?
Okay.
And what's fueling this sentiment?
Albertan separatism, or Alberta independence, is a movement advocating for the province to secede from Canada
Okay,
and become a sovereign nation.
right.
It's not a new phenomenon with roots going back to the 1930s. It's been simmering for decades,
Uh-huh.
fueled by a mix of economic, political, and cultural factors.
So what are some of the key issues that Albertans have with the federal government?
Well, one major issue is the feeling of economic imbalance.
Okay.
Alberta is rich in natural resources,
Right,
especially oil and gas.
right.
And many Albertans believe they contribute more to the Canadian economy
Uh-huh.
than they receive back in federal spending and services.
It's like they feel exploited giving more than they get.
Exactly. There's also resentment toward federal policies perceived as hindering Alberta's economic growth,
Right.
especially in the energy sector.
Uh-huh.
Prime Minister Trudeau's environmental policies like the carbon tax have faced strong opposition in Alberta.
So you've got this clash between economic interests and environmental concerns.
Precisely, then there's the cultural aspect.
Okay.
Alberta often sees itself as more individualistic and entrepreneurial
Uh-huh.
compared to other parts of Canada.
Okay.
Some Albertans feel their values and way of life aren't fully understood or respected by the federal government.
So it's about feeling like an outsider within their own country.
Yes, that's a big part of it. Combine that sense of alienation with economic grievances and political frustrations.
Right.
And you have a recipe for the desire for greater autonomy,
Yeah.
even to the point of separating from Canada.
Now, how does this all connect to the idea of annexation to the U.S.?
While most Albertan separatists want full independence,
Okay.
a smaller group sees joining the U.S. as a more viable option.
Interesting.
They believe Alberta would fare better economically as part of the U.S.,
Uh-huh.
with its less regulated market and closer ties to the global energy industry.
So it's about aligning with a system they see as more favorable to their economic interests.
That's a key factor. Plus, there's the perception that Alberta's values and culture are closer to those of the U.S. U.S.
Mm.
than to those of Eastern Canada.
So it's not just economics, it's about feeling a cultural connection as well.
Right, but it's crucial to remember that Albertan annexationism is still a minority view within the province.
Okay.
And there are big obstacles.
Yeah.
The U.S. government hasn't shown any interest in annexing Alberta,
Right.
and the Canadian government would likely oppose any such move.
It does seem far-fetched, but even if unlikely, it's a fascinating example of how regional issues, economic anxieties, and political rhetoric can come together in unexpected ways.
It highlights the fluidity of borders, the power of ideas, and the constant search for belonging and self-determination.
It makes you wonder, in a world where global dynamics are shifting so rapidly
Yeah,
and these unconventional ideas are gaining traction,
right.
what does the future hold? Could this idea of annexation, while improbable now,
Yeah.
spark wider conversations about the future of North America and the relationship between Canada and the U.S.?
It's certainly food for thought. It reminds us that in a world of constant change,
Right.
even the most improbable scenarios are worth exploring, analyzing, and understanding.
Now let's dig a little deeper
Okay.
into some of the specific groups
Yeah.
promoting this idea of Albertan annexation.
Okay.
Have you come across any notable examples in our research?
Yes, definitely one of the most vocal is the Alberta 51 Project.
Okay.
They've been very active in recent years,
Uh-huh.
raising awareness and promoting their vision for Alberta's future.
So what exactly is the Alberta 51 project proposing?
They believe Alberta should secede from Canada and join the U.S. as the 51st state.
Wow.
Their stated goals include eliminating trade barriers,
Okay.
strengthening Alberta's economy through integration with the U.S. market,
Uh-huh.
and closer ties with the U.S. military for enhanced security.
They seem to see a lot of potential benefits in joining the U.S.
Yeah.
How are they trying to move their agenda forward?
They've been using a mix of approaches, including online campaigns, social media engagement, and even organizing rallies and events.
Okay.
They're working to mobilize public support and build momentum for their cause.
Our sources mentioned some interesting details about their efforts,
Okay.
like selling bumper stickers and launching a change.org petition for Alberta statehood.
That's right. They're trying to raise awareness and build a community around those who support their vision.
Right.
They're also trying to gain financial support through fundraising,
Okay.
claiming to have collected money for promotional billboards.
It's fascinating how they're using a combination of traditional and modern methods to spread their message.
It reflects how social and political movements are evolving in the digital age.
Yeah.
They're harnessing the power of online platforms
Yeah.
to connect with like-minded people, mobilize support, and amplify their message.
Now, besides the Alberta 51 project, are there any other notable figures or groups pushing for annexation?
While there's no organized political party specifically advocating for it, there are individuals who voice support.
Okay.
One example is Kevin O'Leary,
Oh, right.
the Canadian businessman and TV personality.
Mr. Wonderful from Shark Tank.
Yes, that's him. He's been vocal about his belief that Alberta would be better off economically as part of the U.S.
Right.
And he's even facilitated meetings between Alberta Premier Danielle Smith
Uh-huh.
and Donald Trump to discuss energy relations and potential closer ties.
So he's using his platform and connections to influence the conversation.
Exactly. He's a prominent figure, and his endorsement, even if informal,
Right.
adds a certain level of legitimacy and visibility to the idea.
What about Danielle Smith herself? What's her stance on annexation?
It's a bit more nuanced.
Okay.
While she's met with Trump
Right.
and expressed sympathy for some of the grievances driving Albertan separatism,
Okay.
she hasn't explicitly endorsed annexation.
Right.
Her focus has been on securing greater autonomy for Alberta within Canada,
Uh-huh.
especially on issues like energy policy and resource management.
It sounds like she's walking a tightrope,
Yeah.
trying to appease her base, which includes a significant number of separatist sympathizers,
Yeah.
while maintaining a functional relationship with the federal government.
It's a delicate balancing act for sure, a reminder that politics is often about navigating complex and sometimes conflicting interests.
Especially in a province like Alberta where regional identity is so strong
Yeah.
and economic anxieties are running high. Now, even though annexation is unlikely, the fact that it's being discussed and there are groups actively promoting it
Right.
tells us something about the current state of things.
Yeah.
It reflects a growing dissatisfaction with the status quo,
Yeah.
both in Alberta and beyond.
It's a sign of the times, wouldn't you say?
Right.
In a world where globalization is facing pushback and nationalism is on the rise,
Uh-huh.
people are questioning established systems and searching for new ways to define their identities and secure their interests.
Which brings us to a crucial question.
Okay.
If annexation isn't the answer,
Right.
what are the alternative solutions to address the underlying issues driving this sentiment,
That's the million-dollar question.
right?
It's one that demands serious consideration and open dialogue.
Yeah,
We need to find ways to create a more inclusive and equitable system
right.
where regions feel heard and respected and economic opportunities are more evenly distributed.
It's about making the whole greater than the sum of its parts.
Precisely, and that requires both political will and creative solutions.
Right,
It's about listening to the concerns of those who feel alienated,
right.
addressing their legitimate grievances, and finding common ground on issues that divide us.
It's about building bridges instead of walls.
Exactly. It's a process that requires empathy, understanding, and a willingness to compromise.
Yeah,
It's not easy,
right.
but it's essential for the long-term health and stability of any nation, especially one as diverse and complex as Canada.
Now let's shift our focus back to the broader implications of Trump's annexation talk.
Okay.
Even if it's not a serious policy proposal, what does it say about the current state of U.S.-Canadian relations?
It's definitely not a sign of a healthy and stable relationship.
Right,
It creates tension, mistrust, and uncertainty,
right.
undermining the cooperation and partnership that have all characterized the U.S.-Canadian bond.
Our sources highlight how Canadian officials have strongly criticized Trump's rhetoric,
Yeah.
seeing it as disrespectful and damaging to Canada's sovereignty.
And rightfully so. It's a clear violation of diplomatic norms
Right.
and a departure from the mutual respect that has defined their relationship for decades.
Beyond the immediate diplomatic fallout,
Yeah.
there are longer-term consequences.
Like,
How does this rhetoric impact the perception of the U.S. on the global stage?
it's not a good look.
Right,
It reinforces the image of a country willing to bully its neighbors,
right,
disregard international norms,
right.
and prioritize its own interests above all else.
And in a world where global power dynamics are constantly shifting and alliances are being tested,
Yeah,
this kind of behavior can have far-reaching consequences.
right.
It can weaken the U.S.'s position as a leader and a reliable partner.
Absolutely. It makes other countries hesitant to align themselves too closely with the U.S.
Right?
for fear of becoming the next target of its aggressive rhetoric or actions.
So it's a self-defeating strategy in the long run.
Precisely, it undermines the very power and influence the U.S. is trying to project.
Let's dive into the specific ways Trump's annexation talk has impacted relations.
Okay.
Our sources mention a few key areas where we can see the strain.
What are those?
One area is trade.
Mm-hmm.
Trump's repeated threats of tariffs have created uncertainty and anxiety for Canadian businesses exporting to the U.S.
Yeah, it's not just the potential economic damage,
Right,
but the erosion of trust.
right,
When a country's leader constantly threatens economic punishment,
right.
it makes building and maintaining strong trade partnerships very difficult.
Absolutely. It creates a climate of fear and instability, which isn't conducive to a healthy and mutually beneficial economic relationship.
Absolutely.
Then there's the impact on border security.
Okay.
Trump's rhetoric has fueled a sense of insecurity along the U.S.-Canadian border,
Yeah.
leading to increased scrutiny and delays at border crossing.
And it goes beyond practical inconveniences.
Right.
It's about the symbolic significance of a border that has long represented friendship and cooperation.
Right,
When that border becomes a source of tension and suspicion,
right. It weakens the very foundation of the relationship. And beyond trade and border security, there's the broader question of diplomatic relations.
okay.
Trump's annexation talk has created a rift between the two governments,
Yeah.
making it harder to cooperate on issues of mutual interest, like climate change defense and intelligence sharing.
Exactly. When there's a lack of trust and respect at the highest levels,
Right.
it affects all aspects of the relationship.
Right.
It becomes harder to find common ground, negotiate effectively,
Yeah.
and build consensus on critical issues.
So it's not just about words, it's about the tangible damage those words can inflict on a relationship.
Right.
Long considered one of the most successful and enduring partnerships in the world.
Absolutely. It's a cautionary tale about the power of language, the fragility of trust, and the importance of responsible leadership on the global stage.
Now, despite the current strains, it's essential to remember that the U.S.-Canadian relationship is built on shared values, intertwined economies, and deep personal connections. It's weathered storms before, and it's likely to endure this one, too.
That's a hopeful perspective. It's crucial to highlight the resilience of the relationship and the underlying bonds connecting the two countries.
Right,
But we must acknowledge the damage done
right.
and the work needed to rebuild trust and restore the spirit of partnership.
Exactly. It's about learning from past mistakes,
Yeah,
recommitting to shared goals, and finding ways to address the legitimate concerns of both sides.
it's about recognizing the interdependence of the two countries and working together to create a future that's both prosperous and secure.
Now let's step back and consider the broader historical context of U.S. expansionism.
Okay.
Throughout its history, the U.S. has acquired vast territories,
Right.
often through conquest, purchase, or annexation.
Yeah.
How does this history inform our understanding of the current situation with Canada?
It's crucial to remember that U.S. expansionism has been driven by a mix of ideologies, economic interests, and geopolitical ambitions.
Mm-hmm.
Manifest destiny, for example, was a widely held belief in the 19th century
Yeah.
that the U.S. was destined to expand across the North American continent.
So it was a sense of entitlement,
Exactly.
of a divine right to expand.
Exactly. And this belief fueled westward expansion,
Uh,
often at the expense of Native American tribes and other nations like Mexico.
right.
The annexation of Texas, the Mexican-American War, and the acquisition of vast territories in the West
Right.
were all driven, at least in part, by this expansionist ideology.
So there's a historical precedent for the U.S. seeking to expand its territory, even if it means using force or coercion.
Unfortunately, that's part of the U.S.'s history.
Right.
But it's also important to note that U.S. expansionism has evolved over time.
Okay.
The 20th century saw a shift away from outright territorial conquest
Okay.
toward more subtle forms of influence,
Mm-hmm.
such as economic dominance and military intervention.
So it's less about grabbing land
Right.
and more about shaping the global order to suit U.S. interests.
Precisely. And in the context of the current situation with Canada,
Right.
it's essential to consider whether Trump's annexation talk is a throwback to a bygone era of territorial expansionism
Hmm.
or reflects this more modern approach to projecting power and influence.
That's a key question. Is it about actually absorbing Canada or using the threat of annexation as leverage
Yeah.
to get concessions on trade security or other issues?
That's the heart of the matter.
Right.
It's tough to decipher Trump's true intentions.
Right.
His rhetoric is often bombastic and unpredictable,
Right.
making it hard to separate bluster from genuine policy objectives.
It's a reminder that language can be a powerful tool, both for good and bad.
Absolutely, words can inspire and heal,
Right.
but they can also incite, provoke, and damage.
Right.
And in international relations, the consequences of careless or inflammatory language can be profound.
Now let's discuss the potential legal and political hurdles to annexation.
Okay,
Even if there was political will on both sides,
right.
which there clearly isn't, what would the process actually entail?
It's a complex, multi-layered process.
Okay.
First and foremost, it would require consent from both the U.S. and Canadian governments.
Right.
The U.S. Congress would have to approve accepting Canada as a new state,
Right.
and the Canadian Parliament would have to agree to relinquish its sovereignty.
So it's not a matter of one country imposing its will on the other?
No, it would have to be a mutually agreed-upon decision.
Okay.
Given the overwhelming opposition to annexation in Canada, it's safe to say this scenario is highly improbable.
Right. But for argument's sake, let's say both governments did agree to annexation.
Okay.
What would happen next?
Well, the U.S. Constitution outlines a process for admitting new states.
Uh-huh.
It involves creating a state constitution, a vote by the residents of the territory seeking statehood,
Right.
and approval by the U.S. Congress.
So it's a fairly lengthy and involved process.
Yes, it's not something that happens overnight. There are numerous steps, checks and balances, and
Right.
opportunities for debate and opposition.
Right.
And in Canada's case, given its size and complexity, the process would likely be even more intricate and protracted.
Now let's look at historical examples of U.S. statehood.
Okay.
Are there any parallels we can draw to the hypothetical situation with Canada?
The U.S. has admitted 37 states since its founding,
Wow.
each with its own unique circumstances,
Right.
but a few examples might offer some insights.
Our sources mention Texas and Hawaii
Okay.
as particularly relevant cases. Why those two?
Well, Texas was an independent republic
Uh-huh.
before joining the U.S. in 1845.
Okay.
It shows that annexation doesn't always involve a territory being absorbed by a larger power.
Right.
It can also involve a sovereign nation choosing to join another.
So it's about a voluntary union rather than a forced takeover.
Exactly. And in the case of Hawaii,
Okay.
it was a kingdom before being annexed by the U.S. in 1898.
Okay.
It's more controversial,
Right.
as many Native Hawaiians oppose the annexation,
Huh.
and some see it as an act of imperialism.
It reminds us that annexation can be complex and contested with winners and losers.
Precisely, these historical examples highlight the importance of considering all perspectives
Right.
and ensuring any annexation process is fair, just, and respects everyone's rights.
Even though annexation is highly improbable, exploring these hypothetical scenarios has been a fascinating exercise.
It has.
It's made us think critically about the forces shaping our world, the complexities of international relations, and the enduring search for identity and belonging.
It also reminds us that history isn't static.
Right,
It's dynamic and ever-evolving.
right.
And the past offers valuable insights into the present and future.
Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive,
Yeah.
I have a question for you, our listener.
Okay.
We've explored the arguments, potential impacts, and historical context of this annexation idea.
Right.
But what are your thoughts? Is
Yeah.
it a conversation worth having?
Yeah.
Does it shed light on important issues, or is it a distraction from more pressing concerns?
I'm curious too.
We'd love to hear your take. Feel free to share your insights on our social media channels. We'll be back with more on this fascinating topic soon.
Sounds good. You know what strikes me is how much the world has changed since the days of traditional territorial expansion.
I'm curious about that. What do you mean?
Well, in the past, conquering land was the main way to gain power and wealth.
Right.
But in the 21st century, it's a different game.
Yeah.
Economic influence, technological dominance, and control over information are arguably just as important, if not more so, than physical territory.
So the rules have changed. It's not just about brute force anymore.
Exactly. Trump's annexation talk seems almost out of place in this context.
Yeah.
Like something from a different era. It's as if he's using an outdated playbook.
It's like he's trying to play checkers while everyone else is playing chess.
That's a great analogy. It makes you wonder if this type of rhetoric is actually effective in achieving its goals, whatever they might be.
From what we've seen, it seems to have backfired in some ways. It's strained relations with Canada, potentially even strengthened Canadian national identity that doesn't seem to serve U.S. interests.
It underscores how, in today's interconnected world, soft power diplomacy and strong alliances are often more effective than threats and aggression.
Let's shift gears a bit and delve into some of the specific issues raised in the context of this annexation discussion.
Okay.
One that keeps coming up is healthcare. Canada has a universal healthcare system, while the U.S. does not. How would that be reconciled if Canada were to become part of the U.S.?
Oh, man. Imagine the healthcare debate if Canada joined the U.S.
I know, right?
Their universal system clashing with our complex mix of private and public programs, the U.S. system is often criticized for its high costs, inefficiencies, and inequities.
And Canadians are fiercely proud of their healthcare system.
Yes.
They see it as a core value, a symbol of their commitment to social justice and equality.
Absolutely, and it consistently ranks as one of the best globally
Right.
for access, affordability, and quality of care.
It's a big deal up there.
It's difficult to imagine Canadians readily giving that up to adopt the U.S. system.
It would probably be a major point of contention. It's hard to see how the two systems could be merged without significant disruptions and potentially negative consequences for both sides.
It highlights how healthcare isn't just about economics or logistics. It's about deeply held values and beliefs.
Trying to force one system onto the other would likely face strong opposition and could have unforeseen and potentially destabilizing consequences.
Exactly.
Another issue that comes up is gun control. Canada has much stricter gun laws than the U.S., focusing on licensing, registration, and background checks. How would that difference be handled if Canada were to become a U.S. state?
That's another area where we see a stark contrast.
Right.
The U.S. has a strong gun culture rooted in the Second Amendment, which guarantees the right to bear arms. Gun ownership is widespread, and there's a lot of resistance to any attempts to restrict access to firearms.
And in Canada, there's a much stronger emphasis on public safety and a belief that stricter gun control is essential to reducing gun violence.
Absolutely, this difference in perspective would likely cause significant challenges if Canada were to become part of the U.S. It's hard to imagine Canadian gun laws being overwritten or weakened to conform to U.S. standards.
It would likely be a major sticking point in any annexation discussions.
Yes, it reminds us that cultural differences, legal traditions, and ingrained beliefs can create significant obstacles to integration,
Right.
even between countries with a shared history and language.
Let's talk about the potential impact on Indigenous communities. Canada has a large Indigenous population with distinct rights and treaties. How would annexation affect their status and relationship with the U.S. government?
That's a crucial question that deserves careful consideration. Indigenous communities in Canada have a long and complex history with both the Canadian and U.S. governments, often marked by broken promises, forced assimilation, and discrimination.
And in recent decades, there's been a growing movement for Indigenous self-determination and recognition of their inherent rights.
Absolutely. If Canada were to become part of the U.S., it's essential that the rights and treaties of Indigenous communities are protected and upheld. It would require a deep understanding of their unique history, legal traditions, and cultural practices.
It's about ensuring they have a voice in the process and that their interests are represented.
Exactly. It reminds us that annexation isn't just about merging territories. It's about merging people, cultures, and histories, each with its own complexities and sensitivities.
Let's zoom out a bit and consider the broader geopolitical implications of annexation. How would it affect the balance of power in North America and the relationship between the U.S. and other countries?
The creation of a larger and more powerful U.S. would undoubtedly have significant repercussions globally. It would change the dynamics of trade security and diplomacy in the region and beyond.
It's hard to imagine other countries, especially those close to the U.S., just sitting back and watching this unfold without any reaction.
Absolutely. It would likely trigger concerns and potentially countermeasures from countries that see the expansion of U.S. power as a threat to their interests or security.
It would even lead to a new era of geopolitical rivalry and competition, potentially destabilizing the existing world order.
It reminds us that even seemingly isolated events can have ripple effects that extend far beyond their immediate context. The world's interconnectedness means actions taken in one place can have profound consequences elsewhere.
Now let's turn to the potential impact on U.S. domestic politics. Adding Canada with its large population and distinct political culture would undoubtedly shake up the existing political landscape.
To say the least, the U.S. political system is already deeply polarized, with two dominant parties constantly vying for power. Adding Canada with its own unique political parties and viewpoints would likely further complicate an already tense political environment.
It's hard to predict how it would all play out, but it's safe to say it would create new alliances, new divisions, and new challenges to the existing power structures.
It's a reminder that annexation is not just about geography, it's about people, their beliefs, their values, and their aspirations. Merging those into an existing system is a complex and often unpredictable process.
Now, before we wrap up this segment, I want to address a question some listeners might be asking. Why are we even discussing this annexation seems so improbable? So far-fetched, isn't it a waste of time and energy?
That's a valid question, but I think there's value in exploring even the most improbable scenarios. It encourages us to think critically about the world around us, to challenge our assumptions, and consider alternative perspectives.
It's about broadening our understanding of the forces shaping our lives, even if those forces seem distant or abstract.
Exactly. And in the case of annexation, while it's highly unlikely, it raises important questions about national identity, the nature of power, the challenges of integration, and the future of North America.
It's about starting conversations, generating new insights, and perhaps even inspiring creative solutions to the challenges our world faces.
And in these times of rapid change and uncertainty, those conversations are more critical than ever.
It's also a good point that even though we're focusing on annexation, the underlying issues we're discussing are relevant far beyond this one hypothetical scenario.
You're absolutely right. The themes of economic anxiety, cultural identity, and political polarization are playing out worldwide, not just in U.S.-Canadian relations.
Exactly. So even if you're listening to this thinking, well, I'm not Canadian, this doesn't really apply to me, there are still some universal takeaways here.
If we look at the bigger picture, what we're seeing is a kind of global renegotiation of what it means to be a nation, a citizen, a member of a community.
Right. In a world where information flows so freely, economies are intertwined, and people can connect across borders instantly, those old ideas of hard lines on a map begin to feel a bit outdated.
And that tension between the old ways and the new realities is where a lot of friction comes from. It's what's fueling those feelings of discontent, those searches for identity, those questions of who are we and where do we belong.
Wow, that's a great point. It makes you wonder how individual actions can impact global cooperation. Like, what does this all mean for the future of tackling issues that require collective action, climate change, pandemics, international conflict? If everyone's retreating into their own little corners, how can we address these problems?
These are crucial questions, and I don't have all the answers, but I think it begins with recognizing that in many ways we're more interconnecting than ever before. What affects one part of the world inevitably ripples out to others.
So we can't just ignore what's happening in other countries and dismiss it as not our problem.
Exactly. And it's not just about governments and institutions. It's about individuals, too. It's about engaging in respectful dialogue, trying to understand different perspectives, and finding ways to bridge those divides.
It feels like we could talk about this for hours, but we are running short on time for this segment. Before we move on, any final thoughts for our listeners?
I would just encourage everyone to stay curious, keep questioning, and keep those global narratives flowing. The more we understand about our complex world, the better equipped we'll be to navigate the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. The more we learn, the more we understand, the better equipped we are to navigate this increasingly complex world.
I couldn't agree more, and that brings us back to the idea of annexation. While it might seem like a fringe concept,
Right.
it offers a unique lens for understanding broader global trends.
That's an interesting point. It's like using this seemingly out there idea as a way to examine these bigger issues of identity, power, and change.
Exactly. Think about it. This conversation has touched on economic anxiety, cultural identity, political polarization,
Right.
the role of technology, and even the changing nature of power in the 21st century.
It's been a whirlwind tour of some pretty weighty topics.
It has.
And speaking of weighty topics, we haven't even gotten into the potential environmental impacts of annexation.
Oh, right.
What do our sources say about that?
Well, that's a crucial aspect that deserves attention.
Right.
Merging two countries with distinct environmental policies and practices would have consequences, both positive and negative.
Okay.
On the one hand, greater cooperation on environmental policies could lead to more effective conservation efforts and a more coordinated approach to climate change.
That makes sense. A united front against a common enemy.
Right, but on the other hand, there's a risk that economic interests might take precedence over environmental concerns, potentially leading to increased exploitation of natural resources and a weakening of environmental regulations.
It's a classic dilemma, balancing economic growth with environmental sustainability. Not an easy task.
Not at all, and it highlights the need for careful consideration of the potential trade-offs involved in any kind of large-scale political or economic integration.
It also raises the question of how citizens would engage in this process. Would there be public referendums? How would different voices be heard and represented?
Those are important considerations. Annexation or any significant political change should involve a democratic process where citizens have a voice in shaping their future.
It's about ensuring that decisions are made with the consent of the governed, which, based on what we've seen in our sources, seems pretty unlikely in this case.
That's right, but even though annexation might not be on the horizon, the conversation itself is valuable. It challenges us to think about the future we want to create and the role we can play in shaping that future.
And maybe that's the biggest takeaway here. It's not just about Canada, the U.S., or even annexation. It's about engaging in thoughtful, informed dialogue about the challenges and opportunities facing our world.
It's about recognizing our interconnectedness, seeking to understand different perspectives, and working together to build a more just equitable and sustainable future for all.
Well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of geopolitics, national identity, and the unexpected consequences of unconventional ideas.
It's been a pleasure.
And to our listeners, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What are your takeaway from this conversation? What other global narratives are you curious about? Connect with us on social media or visit our website. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a topic that's sure to spark your curiosity and get you thinking about the world in new ways. Until then, stay curious.